The majority of people believe that the Russian Revolution started in 1917 when Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik followers stormed the Winter Palace, seized control, and announced the birth of a new communist state. This is the narrative that has found its way into history textbooks. It is the version that most of us were taught. However, that version is incomplete at best and dangerously deceptive at worst, because the reality is that the Russian Revolution did not begin with Lenin. It did not begin with Marx. It did not even begin within the 20th century. The forces that tore apart the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty and redrew the borders of Europe were set in motion nearly a full century before Lenin ever published a single pamphlet. What occurred in 1917 was not the initial spark, it was the final explosion. The fuse had been smoldering for generations, ignited by emperors who attempted to reform a failing system, fueled by millions of people who were treated as mere property, and fanned by conflicts that Russia had no reason to be fighting. The story of the Russian Revolution is not a tale about one man with a specific plan. It is a story about a system so decayed, so bloated, and so indifferent to human agony that by the time it finally disintegrated, no one should have been surprised. And yet, almost everyone was. To understand what truly triggered the Russian Revolution, you have to go back to a time when Russia was not just lagging behind the rest of Europe, but operating in an entirely different century. By the middle of the 1800s, Britain had already completed its Industrial Revolution. France had toppled its monarchy, restored it, and toppled it once again. The United States had fought a civil war and ended slavery. But in Russia, more than 23 million human beings were still categorized as serfs, which was effectively a polite term for slaves. These were individuals who could be bought and sold along with the land they worked on. They possessed no legal rights. They could not depart from their villages without permission. They could not marry without their landlord's consent. They could be beaten, conscripted, or relocated at the whim of whichever noble happened to own them. This was not some ancient relic from the medieval era. This was Russia in 1861. Now, the man sitting on the throne at that time was Tsar Alexander II. He was something of an anomaly among Russian rulers. He had received a liberal education and had traveled throughout Europe. Unlike his father, Nicholas the Firm, who had ruled with an iron fist and crushed any sign of dissent, Alexander had actually reached a somewhat radical conclusion for a Russian emperor. He believed that serfdom had to end, not because he was a humanitarian, mind you, but because he was a pragmatist. Russia had just been humiliated in the Crimean War, losing to a coalition of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire on its own doorstep. The defeat exposed everything that was wrong with the Russian state. Its military was obsolete, its economy was stagnant, its bureaucracy was corrupt and inefficient, and the primary reason for all of it was that the entire country was still operating on a feudal labor system that had been obsolete in Western Europe for centuries. Alexander reportedly told a group of Moscow nobles that it was better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for it to abolish itself from below. In other words, he was not liberating the serfs because it was the moral thing to do. He was freeing them because he feared what would happen if he did not. On March 3, 1861, Alexander signed the Emancipation Manifesto. With a stroke of a pen, over 23 million serfs were granted their personal freedom. They gained the right to marry without consent, to own property, and to engage in trade. It was described by some as the greatest social upheaval since the French Revolution. But here is where the story gets complicated, because the emancipation was not the liberation it appeared to be. Yes, the serfs were technically free, but the land they had worked for generations was not simply handed over to them. Instead, they were required to purchase it from their former landlords through a system of redemption payments that would take 49 years to complete. 49 years, nearly half a century of debt just to own the soil they had been plowing since birth. Furthermore, the plots they received were often smaller and less productive than the land they had previously farmed. Many former serfs found themselves in a worse position than before, technically free but economically trapped. They were free in name, but chained by debt. And here is the critical point that most people miss when they study the revolution. The emancipation of 1861 did not solve Russia's social crisis. It created a new one. It created an enormous class of landless, indebted peasants who had been promised freedom and received something that felt like a cruel imitation of it. These were people who now had just enough autonomy to understand how little they actually possessed. That awareness, that gap between the promise and the reality, became the breeding ground for every revolutionary movement that followed. Alexander II did not stop at emancipation. He introduced a whole series of reforms. He modernized the judicial system, establishing independent courts and trial by jury for the first time in Russian history. He created the zemstvos, local assemblies that gave communities a limited voice in their own governance. He reformed the military, reducing the term of service from 25 years to 6. He relaxed censorship and expanded access to university education. For a Russian czar, these were extraordinary steps by any reasonable measure. Alexander was the most progressive ruler Russia had ever seen, and for his troubles, they killed him. On March 13, 1881, a group of revolutionaries from an organization called the Narodnaya Volya, which translates to the people's will, threw a bomb at Alexander's carriage as he rode through the streets of St. Petersburg. The first bomb damaged the carriage but did not kill the Tsar. When Alexander stepped out to inspect the damage and check on his wounded guards, a second bomber approached and detonated his device at the Tsar's feet. Alexander's legs were shattered. His abdomen was torn open. He was carried back to the Winter Palace where he bled to death on the floor of his study. He had been on his way to sign a new decree that would have established an elected consultative body, a proto-parliament. That document died with him. Now this is a pivotal moment, and it is worth pausing here to absorb what happened. The most reform-minded czar in Russian history, the man who freed the serfs, modernized the courts, and was literally on his way to introduce representative government, was assassinated by revolutionaries who wanted change faster than he could deliver it. And the consequence of that assassination was not more reform, it was the exact opposite. Alexander's son, Alexander III, ascended to the throne consumed by grief and fury. He reversed many of his father's reforms, cracked down on dissent with brutal force, expanded the power of the secret police, restricted press freedoms, and imposed a policy of aggressive Russification on the ethnic minorities within the empire. The lesson Alexander III took from his father's murder was simple. Reform was weakness, and liberalism was a death sentence. The only way to hold Russia together was through absolute, unyielding, autocratic power. And it is this decision, this hardening of the regime in the 1880s, that set the stage for everything that came after. Because Alexander III did not solve Russia's problems, he buried them. He pushed them underground, where they festered and grew in the dark. And when his son Nicholas inherited the throne in 1894, he inherited a country that was a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. But before we get to Nicholas, we need to talk about the Decembrists, because the revolutionary tradition in Russia did not begin with the assassination of Alexander II. It began much earlier, on a freezing December morning in 1825, when a group of young military officers attempted to overthrow the government in what became known as the Decembrist Revolt. These were not peasants or workers. These were aristocrats, sons of the noble class, educated men who had served in the Russian army during the Napoleonic Wars. They had marched across Europe. They had seen France. They had seen constitutional governments and free citizens in a world where people had rights that could not be revoked by a single man's decree. And when they returned to Russia, they looked at their own country and were horrified. The contrast was staggering. While the rest of Europe was modernizing, Russia was still a feudal empire where millions of people were treated as livestock. These officers formed secret societies, the Union of Salvation, the Union of Welfare, the Northern Society, and the Southern Society. They began planning a revolution. Their opportunity came in December 1825 when Tsar Alexander III died unexpectedly, and the succession to the throne became confused. Alexander had no sons. His brother Constantine was next in line, but had secretly renounced his claim. The throne was supposed to pass to the younger brother Nicholas, but the paperwork was muddled, and for a brief window of time, nobody in Russia knew who was actually in charge. The Decembrists seized the moment. On December 26th, roughly 3,000 soldiers marched into Senate Square in St. Petersburg, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas and demanding a constitution and the abolition of serfdom. It was a disaster. The revolt was poorly organized, plagued by indecision, and crushed within hours. Nicholas ordered his troops to open fire with artillery on the rebels in the square. Dozens were killed and hundreds were arrested. 5 of the ringleaders were hanged. Over 100 were sent to Siberia in chains. Nicholas I, now firmly seated on the throne, became one of the most repressive czars in Russian history. He established the notorious Third Section, a secret police force dedicated to rooting out political dissent, and he made it clear that any talk of reform or a constitution would be treated as treason. But here's the thing about the Decembrists. They failed. They failed spectacularly, and yet they planted a seed that would never die. Their martyrdom became a rallying point for every generation of Russian revolutionaries that followed. As one later revolutionary put it, the Decembrists awakened an entire generation. Their ideas, their sacrifice, and their willingness to risk everything for a vision of a better Russia echoed through the decades. Every revolutionary movement that came after them, from the Narodniks to the Social Democrats to the Bolsheviks, traced their lineage back to that freezing morning in Senate Square. So when people say the Russian Revolution started with Lenin, they are skipping nearly a century of history. The desire for change in Russia was not manufactured by Marxist intellectuals in exile. It was organic. It grew out of the soil itself, nourished by centuries of oppression and watered by the blood of reformers and revolutionaries alike. Now let us talk about what happened when Nicholas II took the throne, because this is where the story accelerates toward catastrophe. Nicholas ascended to power in 1894, and from the very beginning, it was clear that he was profoundly unsuited for the role. He was 26 years old, shy, indecisive, and deeply attached to the idea of autocratic rule that his father had championed. When a delegation of Zemstvo leaders approached him early in his reign, politely suggesting that they be given a greater voice in governance, Nicholas dismissed their request as senseless dreams. He made it clear that he intended to maintain autocratic power as firmly as his father had. This was not the response of a confident ruler. It was the response of a man clinging to a system he did not know how to change. And Russia desperately needed change. By the turn of the century, the country was undergoing rapid industrialization, largely financed by foreign capital and driven by the policies of Finance Minister Sergei Vita. Factories were springing up in St. Petersburg, Moscow, and across the Ural region. The railroad network was expanding. Industrial output was growing at an impressive rate. But the human cost of this transformation was staggering. Workers in Russian factories labored for 11.5 hours a day, sometimes more. They were paid wages that barely kept them alive. They lived in overcrowded, unsanitary barracks. They had no legal right to form unions, no right to strike, and no mechanism whatsoever to air their grievances. Russia was importing Western technology in Western capital, but it was not importing Western labor protections. It was building a modern industrial economy on top of a medieval political system, and the contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, the peasant problem had only gotten worse since the emancipation. The population had exploded, but the amount of available land had not. Plots were subdivided with each generation until many families were working strips of land too small to sustain themselves. Famines struck with alarming regularity. In 1891, a devastating famine killed between 375,000 and 400,000 people. The government's response was slow, disorganized, and widely perceived as indifferent. Educated Russians organized private relief efforts, and in doing so, they saw with their own eyes the depth of suffering in the countryside. It radicalized an entire generation of intellectuals and professionals. Into this volatile mix, add a war that nobody needed and nobody wanted. In 1904, Russia stumbled into a military conflict with Japan over competing imperial ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. The Russo-Japanese War was supposed to be a short, victorious affair, a convenient distraction from domestic troubles. One of the Tsar's ministers is reported to have said that what Russia needed was a small, victorious war to stem the tide of revolution. What Russia got instead was one of the most humiliating military defeats in its history. The Japanese launched a surprise attack on the Russian naval base at Port Arthur in February 1904, 3 hours before Russia had even received the formal declaration of war. From there, it was a cascade of disasters. Russian forces were defeated at the Yalu River, at Mukden, and finally, most devastatingly, at the Battle of Tsushima, where the Japanese Navy annihilated Russia's Baltic fleet after it had sailed halfway around the world to reach the Pacific. Russia lost 11 battleships, 4 cruisers, and 6 destroyers. Japan lost 3 torpedo boats. It was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation on a global scale. For the first time in modern history, a European great power had been decisively beaten by an Asian nation. The shock reverberated far beyond Russia's borders, inspiring anti-colonial movements across Asia. But within Russia itself, the effect was immediate and devastating. The Tsar's prestige, already fragile, shattered. And then came Bloody Sunday. On January 22, 1905, a massive column of workers and their families marched toward the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They were led by a priest named Father Georgy Gapon, and they carried a petition addressed directly to the Tsar. The petition was respectful, almost reverential. It called the Tsar their father. It begged for his help. It asked for basic reforms, better working conditions, fair wages, an 8-hour workday, freedom of speech and assembly, an end to the war with Japan, and a national parliament elected by the people. The marchers carried icons and portraits of the Tsar. They sang hymns. They believed with an almost childlike faith that if only the Tsar could hear their suffering, he would help them. The Tsar was not even in the city. He had retreated to his palace outside St. Petersburg. But what awaited the marchers was far worse than his absence. As the crowds approached the Winter Palace, soldiers opened fire. Not warning shots, not rubber bullets, live ammunition into a crowd of unarmed men, women, and children carrying religious icons and pictures of their sovereign. The official death toll was around 130. Eyewitness accounts and independent estimates put the number much higher, possibly over 1,000. Hundreds more were wounded. Bloody Sunday destroyed something that could never be rebuilt. It destroyed the myth that the Tsar was the father of his people, that he cared about their suffering, and that the autocracy, however imperfect, was ultimately benevolent. After January 22, 1905, the bond between the Russian people and their Tsar was broken. Workers who had marched with icons and hymns returned to their factories as revolutionaries. The event triggered a wave of strikes, protests, and uprisings across the entire Russian Empire. Peasants seized land. Workers formed councils called Soviets, the first democratic working-class bodies in Russian history. Sailors on the battleship Potemkin mutinied. Ethnic minorities in Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states rose up. By October, a general strike had paralyzed the country, shutting down railroads, factories, and telegraph lines. Russia was on the brink of total collapse. Nicholas, terrified, issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and an elected parliament called the Duma. It was enough to divide the opposition and take the edge off the crisis. Moderate liberals accepted the concessions. Workers and radicals did not. The government used the split to crush the remaining resistance with brutal force. By early 1906, the revolution of 1905 was over, but it was not a victory for the Tsar. It was a reprieve, and everyone knew it. Let me be clear about something. The revolution of 1905 is one of the most underappreciated events in modern history. Everything that happened in 1917, the February Revolution, the October Revolution, the rise of the Soviets, the fall of the Tsar, all of it was rehearsed in 1905. The workers learned how to organize. They learned how to strike. They learned that the Tsar would shoot them if they asked nicely. So next time, they would not ask nicely. The young Leon Trotsky, who would later become one of the architects of the Bolshevik seizure of power, was elected head of the St. Petersburg Soviet in 1905 at just 25 years of age. These were the training grounds of revolution, the place where tactics were tested, leadership was forged, and illusions were shattered. Now, after 1905, a window of opportunity opened. Nicholas had promised a parliament. He had a chance to modernize, to gradually transform Russia into a constitutional monarchy, and to diffuse the revolutionary pressure from below. And for a brief moment, it looked like that might happen. The man most responsible for this possibility was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, who served from 1906 to 1911. Stolypin pursued a dual strategy. On one hand, he crushed revolutionary activity with ruthless efficiency, executing so many people by hanging that the noose became known as Stolypin's necktie. On the other hand, he introduced ambitious agrarian reforms designed to create a class of prosperous, conservative peasant landowners who would have a stake in the system and no interest in revolution. He dissolved the peasant communes and allowed individual peasants to consolidate their landholdings and farm independently. The idea was simple but profound. Give the peasants property and they will defend the system that protects their property. It was working. Slowly, unevenly, but measurably, Stolypin's reforms were beginning to transform the Russian countryside. Agricultural productivity was increasing. A class of independent farmers was beginning to emerge. Given another 20 years, Stolypin believed, Russia could be fundamentally transformed. But he did not get 20 years. In 1911, Stolypin was assassinated, shot during a performance at the Kiev Opera House, by a man who was simultaneously a revolutionary and a police informant. The circumstances were suspicious, to say the least. There were rumors that elements within the Tsar's own court had facilitated the assassination because they saw Stolypin's reforms as a threat to the old aristocratic order. Whether or not that is true, the effect was the same. Russia's last best chance at peaceful reform died with Stolypin. And then, just 3 years later, the Great War began. World War I did not cause the Russian Revolution, but it made the revolution inevitable. It took every crack in the Russian system, every unresolved tension, and every festering wound, and tore them wide open. Russia entered the war in August 1914 with a surge of patriotic enthusiasm. The capital, St. Petersburg, was renamed Petrograd because the old name sounded too German. Crowds cheered in the streets. Workers and peasants lined up to enlist. For a brief moment, the war seemed to unite the nation behind the Tsar. That moment did not last. The Russian army was enormous, the largest in Europe, but it was poorly equipped, poorly led, and catastrophically unprepared for modern industrial warfare. Soldiers went to the front without rifles, told to pick up weapons from fallen comrades. Artillery shells ran out within months. The supply chain was a shambles. Communication between headquarters and the front was unreliable. Officers were often incompetent aristocrats who had been promoted based on connections rather than ability. In the first year alone, Russia suffered nearly 2 million casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The battles at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in 1914 were devastating defeats that shattered public confidence in the military command. And then Nicholas made perhaps the single worst decision of his reign. In September 1915, he took personal command of the Russian army, traveling to military headquarters at Mogilev to lead the war effort himself. He had no military training, he had no strategic vision, but he believed it was his divine duty as Tsar to lead his troops. The effect was twofold, and both consequences were catastrophic. First, Nicholas was now personally associated with every military defeat, every failed offensive, and every retreat. The Tsar himself became the face of Russia's humiliation. Second, by leaving the capital, Nicholas left the governance of the Russian Empire in the hands of his wife, Tsarina Alexandra. Alexandra was German-born, a granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. In a country fighting a brutal war against Germany, having a German-born woman running the government was a public relations disaster of the highest order. But it got worse. Alexandra had fallen completely under the influence of a Siberian mystic named Grigory Rasputin, a man whose reputation for debauchery, drunkenness, and bizarre spiritual practices made him one of the most despised figures in Russia. Rasputin had gained access to the royal family through Alexandra's desperate belief that he could heal her son Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. The boy's condition was a closely guarded secret, and Rasputin's apparent ability to stop the bleeding during the worst episodes gave him an almost supernatural hold over the Tsarina. With Nicholas at the front, Alexandra and Rasputin effectively ran the country. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on Rasputin's whims. Competent officials were replaced by sycophants and incompetents who had gained the mystic's favor. Government policy lurched from one incoherent decision to the next. The aristocracy, the military, and the general public were appalled. Rumors spread, some true, some wildly exaggerated, about Rasputin's influence, his sexual escapades, his drinking, and his supposed control over the Tsarina. The monarchy, which had always relied on an aura of sacred authority, became an object of open ridicule and contempt. In December 1916, a group of aristocrats, including Prince Felix Yusupov and a member of the Duma named Vladimir Purishkevich, lured Rasputin to Yusupov's palace and murdered him. The killing was grotesque and has become the stuff of legend. According to the most dramatic accounts, they poisoned him with cyanide-laced wine and cakes. When that failed to kill him, they shot him. When he still did not die, they beat him and eventually threw his body into the freezing Neva River. Whether all the details are accurate is debated by historians, but the killing itself was not disputed, and the conspirators expected that removing Rasputin would somehow save the monarchy. It did not. By the time Rasputin was dead, the monarchy was already beyond saving. By early 1917, Russia was disintegrating. The war had consumed millions of lives. The economy was collapsing under the strain of wartime production. Inflation was rampant. Wages could not keep pace. The rail network, already overextended, was breaking down, which meant that food produced in the countryside was not reaching the cities. In Petrograd, bread lines stretched around city blocks. People stood in the freezing cold for hours, sometimes all night, only to be told that the bread had run out. The temperature that winter dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Workers who could not feed their families had nothing left to lose. And then on February 23, 1917, on International Women's Day, something happened that no one planned and no one controlled. Women textile workers in the Vyborg district of Petrograd walked out of their factories and into the streets. They were cold, hungry, and furious. They shouted for bread. They shouted for an end to the war. They threw snowballs at the windows of neighboring factories and called on the men inside to join them. By the end of that first day, somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 workers were on strike. By the second day, 200,000. By the third, the strike was general. 400,000 people in the streets, students, teachers, white-collar workers, all of them joining the industrial laborers in a massive spontaneous uprising. Nicholas, still at Mogilev, ordered the garrison to suppress the disorders. On February 26th, troops opened fire on demonstrators, killing dozens. But the next day, February 27th, something unprecedented happened. The soldiers refused to keep shooting. Regiment after regiment mutinied, turning their weapons over to the protesters. Soldiers and workers together seized the Peter and Paul Fortress, the telegraph offices, the railway stations, and the arsenals. The government had lost control of its own capital. On March 2, 1917, Nicholas II signed his abdication. He tried to pass the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, but Michael declined it the very next day. 300 years of Romanov rule ended not with a grand revolutionary battle, but with bread riots and a soldiers' mutiny. The February Revolution was over in less than a week, and Lenin was nowhere near it. He was sitting in Zurich, Switzerland, reading about it in the newspapers. He was as surprised as anyone. This is the part of the story that gets lost in the popular narrative. The February Revolution, the one that actually toppled the Tsar, was not a Bolshevik revolution. It was not organized by any political party. It was a spontaneous eruption of popular rage by people who had simply had enough. Workers who could not feed their children, women who had been standing in bread lines since before dawn, soldiers who were tired of being sent to die in a war that made no sense. These were the people who brought down the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty, not Lenin, not the Bolsheviks, not the Communist Party. Ordinary Russians who had been pushed past the breaking point by a system that had failed them over and over again for generations. What followed was a period of chaotic dual power. A provisional government composed mostly of liberal politicians and moderate socialists took nominal control of the country. But alongside it, the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies, held enormous influence over the streets, the factories, and the military. The provisional government wanted to continue the war, maintain order, and hold elections for a proper parliament. The Soviet wanted peace, land reform, and workers' control of industry. The two bodies coexisted uneasily, each claiming authority, neither fully in control. It was only in April 1917, a full month after the Tsar had fallen, that Lenin finally arrived back in Russia. The German government, hoping to destabilize their enemy, had arranged for Lenin and a group of Bolshevik exiles to travel through Germany in a sealed railway car and enter Russia through Finland. Lenin arrived at Petrograd's Finland station to a crowd of supporters, and he immediately began agitating for a second revolution. His message was captured in what became known as the April Theses: peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. It was simple, it was radical, and it was exactly what millions of desperate Russians wanted to hear. But even Lenin's seizure of power in October 1917 was not the beginning. It was the culmination. It was the final act of a drama that had been unfolding for almost a century. The Decembrists in 1825 lit the first match. The serfs freed in 1861 discovered that freedom without land was no freedom at all. The assassins who killed Alexander II in 1881 ensured that reform would be replaced by repression. The workers who marched on Bloody Sunday in 1905 learned that the Tsar was not their father, but their executioner. The soldiers who bled and died in the catastrophe of the Russo-Japanese War demonstrated that the empire was rotting from the inside. Stolypin's assassination in 1911 closed the door on peaceful transformation. And the Great War, that endless meat grinder that consumed an entire generation, delivered the final killing blow. Lenin did not create the revolution, he harvested it. He arrived at precisely the right moment with precisely the right message to claim a revolution that had been building for nearly 100 years. He was brilliant, ruthless, and profoundly opportunistic. But if Lenin had never been born, the revolution would still have happened. Maybe not in exactly the same way. Maybe not with the same ideology. Maybe not with the same outcome. But the forces that produced it, the centuries of serfdom, the failed reforms, the repression, the wars, the famine, the sheer grinding, relentless suffering of hundreds of millions of people across multiple generations, those forces would have produced some kind of reckoning regardless. And that is the real lesson of the Russian Revolution. It is not a story about communism versus capitalism. It is not a story about the Cold War's ideological origins. It is a story about what happens when a ruling class refuses to share power. When a government treats reform as weakness, when the gap between the rich and the poor becomes so vast that it can no longer be bridged by promises. When ordinary people are pushed to the edge of survival, and the only response they receive from those in power is bullets and breadlines. The Russian Empire did not fall because of a conspiracy. It fell because it deserved to fall. It fell because it had spent centuries building a system that enriched a tiny elite at the expense of everyone else. And when that system finally cracked, there was nothing underneath it strong enough to hold the country together. The Romanovs had 300 years to get it right. They had reformers and opportunities and second chances. They had Alexander II who freed the serfs. They had Stolypin who tried to build a middle class. They had the Duma, which could have been the foundation of a constitutional government. And they squandered every single one of those chances because the people at the top could not bring themselves to share even a fraction of their power. So the next time someone tells you that the Russian Revolution started with Lenin, remind them, it started with serfs in chains. It started with officers in Senate Square. It started with a bomb on a St. Petersburg street. It started with a priest leading workers to the Winter Palace. It started with women throwing snowballs at factory windows. The revolution did not begin with one man's ideology. It began with an empire's refusal to change. And that is a lesson that does not belong only to Russia. It belongs to every society that mistakes stability for justice and silence for consent. If this exploration of the hidden roots of history changed how you view the fall of empires, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. We are dedicated to unearthing the truths that time tried to bury. Join us as we dig deeper into the past to understand our present. The next treasury of history will be open soon.